At 4:47 a.m. on September 12, 1942, a single rifle shot cracked through the frozen air above Stalingrad's industrial district. The German patrol never heard it coming. Their lead scout dropped instantly, a perfect headshot from 400 meters away. The remaining soldiers scattered behind rubble, frantically searching for the shooter's position. But the sniper had already vanished into the skeletal remains of a bombed-out tractor factory. The shooter wasn't a grizzled veteran or elite military marksman. She was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, a 19-year-old history student from Kiev who had picked up a rifle only months earlier. This single shot was number 47 in what would become the deadliest individual killing streak of the entire Eastern Front. By the time winter descended on Stalingrad 3 months later, her confirmed kill count would reach 309 enemy soldiers, making her the most lethal female sniper in recorded military history. Every shot she fired represented not just tactical advantage, but a personal vendetta against an invading force that had destroyed her home, murdered her neighbors, and turned her university campus into a battlefield. Lyudmila Mikhailovna Pavlichenko had never intended to become a killer. Born in 1916 in the small Ukrainian town of Bila Tserkva, she grew up during the chaotic years following the Russian Revolution, a period when traditional gender roles were being violently rewritten. Her family moved to Kiev when she was 14, and she enrolled in Kiev University to study history, dreaming of becoming a teacher. But the Soviet Union of the 1930s demanded more than academic pursuits from its citizens. Like all young people, she was required to participate in paramilitary training programs designed to prepare the population for inevitable war. It was during these mandatory sessions that she first held a Mosin Nagant rifle, the standard issue weapon that would later become her trademark. Her instructor noticed immediately that she possessed an unusual talent. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled, and most importantly, she could calculate windage and bullet drop instinctively, adjusting for variables that other trainees struggled to understand even after extensive explanation. She joined a local shooting club and began competing in marksmanship tournaments, racking up medals and developing the fundamental skills that would soon prove invaluable. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, Lyudmila was 24 years old, recently divorced and raising a young son. She could have remained in Kiev as a civilian or taken a support role far from the front lines. Instead, she walked directly to the nearest recruiting station and demanded to be assigned as a combat infantryman. The recruiting officer laughed when she insisted on frontline service. Women were flooding into military service across the Soviet Union, but they were being channeled into medical corps, communications, and logistics roles that kept them away from direct combat. The idea of a young woman serving as a frontline rifleman seemed absurd to the bureaucrats processing applications. They offered her positions as a field nurse or radio operator, safe assignments that wouldn't waste her education. She refused repeatedly, growing more insistent with each rejection. Finally, after hours of argument, a senior officer gave her a test simply to quiet her down. They took her to a shooting range, handed her a rifle, and told her to hit targets at 100 meters. She fired 5 shots and scored 5 perfect hits. They moved the targets to 200 meters. 5 more perfect shots. At 300 meters, she continued hitting center mass with mechanical consistency. The officers exchanged glances, their amusement replaced by genuine interest. They assigned her to the 25th Chapayev Rifle Division as a sniper, making her one of fewer than 2,000 women who would serve in Soviet sniper units during the war. She was issued a Mosin Nagant model 1891/30 rifle fitted with a PE scope, 50 rounds of 7.62 by 54 mm ammunition, and a canvas uniform that hung loosely on her slender frame. Within 3 weeks, she was in Odessa, dug into a trench system south of the city, staring through her scope at German positions 500 meters away. Her first kills came during the siege of Odessa in August 1941, and they haunted her despite her later claims of emotional detachment. She had positioned herself in a destroyed apartment building overlooking a supply route the Germans used for moving ammunition and rations. For 2 days, she remained motionless, eating cold rations and urinating into empty cans to avoid compromising her position. She watched German soldiers through her scope, studying their routines, learning when they felt safe enough to remove their helmets or stand upright. On the third morning, a young German officer emerged from a bunker, stretching in the early sunlight. Completely unaware, he was being observed. Lyudmila centered her crosshairs on his chest and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, and through the scope she watched him collapse, his expression transforming from contentment to confusion to nothing. She felt her stomach turn, bile rising in her throat, but she forced herself to remain still and watch for others responding to the shot. Two soldiers rushed to their fallen officer's aid, and she killed them both with methodical precision before they could drag him to safety. 3 enemy soldiers dead in 90 seconds. She vomited afterward, shaking uncontrollably in her hide, wondering if she could continue. But then she thought about the German bombs that had destroyed her university, the stories of atrocities filtering back from occupied territories, the future her son would face if the invasion succeeded. She wiped her mouth, reloaded her rifle, and settled back into position. Over the following 2 months in Odessa, she would kill 187 enemy soldiers before the city fell and Soviet forces evacuated across the Black Sea to Sevastopol. Sevastopol became a charnel house, a months-long siege that reduced the historic naval city to rubble and corpses. Lyudmila operated in conditions that would have broken less determined snipers. She crawled through sewers filled with human waste and decomposing bodies to reach firing positions. She remained motionless for 12-hour stretches in summer heat that caused heat stroke among soldiers who had the luxury of movement. She survived German counter-sniper operations that killed dozens of her fellow sharpshooters, learning to never fire more than twice from the same position and to constantly vary her patterns. The German command became obsessed with neutralizing her specifically after intelligence reports identified her unusually high kill count. They assigned their own elite snipers to hunt her, trained men who had spent years perfecting their craft on the Eastern Front. She killed 3 of them in direct duels. Shots fired within seconds of each other from concealed positions barely 200 meters apart, each sniper trying to spot the other's muzzle flash before being spotted themselves. In one legendary engagement, she engaged in a 3-day hunt with a German sniper commander who had been terrorizing Soviet positions for weeks. They stalked each other through the ruins of a destroyed factory complex, each trying to predict the other's movements, leaving false signs and dummy positions to draw out a fatal shot. On the 3rd day, she noticed a barely perceptible glint of sunlight reflecting off glass in a collapsed grain silo 300 meters away. She fired instantly, and the German sniper's body tumbled from his hiding place. She would later learn he had 79 confirmed kills and was considered one of Germany's most accomplished marksmen. The Soviet High Command initially viewed her success with deep suspicion bordering on disbelief. Female snipers were a desperate wartime experiment, something that could be quietly discontinued once the crisis passed, and normal military order was restored. When reports began circulating that a single woman had eliminated over 200 enemy soldiers, staff officers assumed the numbers were fabricated for propaganda purposes. They dispatched Commissar to a unit with orders to verify her claims and determine if she was inflating her count. The investigation was thorough and hostile, designed to expose fraud. Each kill required 2 forms of verification: either a spotter's sworn testimony or physical evidence like enemy identification papers retrieved from the body. The commissars interviewed dozens of soldiers who had witnessed her shots, examined her logbooks, and cross-referenced her claims with battlefield reports and German casualty records captured during brief Soviet advances. To their astonishment, her numbers were accurate and possibly even conservative. Many of her kills had occurred when she was operating alone without witnesses, shots she never officially reported because she couldn't meet the verification requirements. The commissars returned to Moscow with a stunning conclusion. Not only were her claims legitimate, but her actual kill count was likely higher than 309. The revelation created a bureaucratic crisis because it meant Soviet doctrine had been fundamentally wrong about women's capabilities in combat roles. Rather than acknowledge this explicitly, the High Command chose to treat Lyudmila as an exceptional anomaly, a statistical outlier that didn't invalidate their general assumptions. News of her effectiveness spread through the Red Army long before Moscow officially acknowledged it. Soviet snipers began requesting transfers to units where female shooters operated, recognizing that mixed gender teams performed better than anyone had predicted. The women brought different observational skills and tactical approaches that complemented traditional male aggression. Lyudmila became an informal mentor to dozens of aspiring female snipers, teaching them not just marksmanship but fieldcraft and psychological resilience. She explained how to manage menstruation in the field without compromising operational security, how to use male soldiers' underestimation as a tactical advantage, how to process the emotional aftermath of killing without descending into either numbness or breakdown. Other female snipers began matching her effectiveness. Nina Lobkovskaya accumulated 89 confirmed kills before her death at age 24. Natalia Kovshova and Maria Polivanova fought together as a team, accumulating 300 combined kills before they were surrounded and chose to detonate grenades rather than surrender. Collectively, Soviet female snipers killed an estimated 12,000 enemy soldiers during the war, a number that German commanders found both militarily significant and psychologically demoralizing. Wehrmacht intelligence reports from 1942 show German troops developed an almost superstitious fear of Soviet female snipers, viewing them as unnaturally deadly and impossible to predict. This psychological impact multiplied their tactical value far beyond simple kill counts. By mid-1942, Lyudmila's effectiveness had made her both a valuable asset and a strategic liability. Her death in combat would hand the Germans a significant propaganda victory and deprive the Red Army of its most accomplished sniper. When she was wounded by mortar shrapnel during the siege of Sevastopol in June 1942, Soviet leadership made an unexpected decision. Rather than return her to combat after she healed, they pulled her from the front lines permanently and assigned her to a diplomatic mission to the United States and Britain. The official explanation was that she could boost Allied morale and encourage American support for opening a second front in Western Europe. The unstated reason was that her survival had become more valuable than her continued combat service. She was 25 years old, holder of the Order of Lenin, and about to become the most famous soldier most Americans had never heard of. Her arrival in Washington, D.C. in August 1942 created exactly the cultural clash Soviet planners had anticipated. American journalists were fascinated by the concept of a female combat soldier, but struggled to take her seriously as a killer. Press conferences devolved into questions about her beauty routine, whether she wore makeup in combat, and how she managed to find a husband despite her unfeminine occupation. One journalist asked if she used powder compacts to check her makeup in the field, prompting her to acidly respond that she used them to check for enemy movement in reflections. Eleanor Roosevelt, then First Lady, took personal interest in Lyudmila's tour and recognized the condescension she faced from American media and military officials. She arranged for Lyudmila to speak at public rallies where she could address audiences directly without journalistic filters. At one Chicago event, after being asked repeatedly about cosmetics and romance, Lyudmila stepped to the microphone and delivered an improvised speech that silenced her questioners. She described watching German soldiers burn villages, execute civilians, and rape women before killing them. She explained that every one of her 309 confirmed kills represented an invader who would never again destroy a Soviet home or murder a Soviet child. She concluded by asking the audience why American journalists cared more about her lipstick choices than the fact that she had killed 309 fascists while American forces had yet to open a serious second front in Europe. The speech was reprinted in newspapers nationwide and transformed her American tour from a curiosity into a political phenomenon. She spoke at fundraising events that generated millions of dollars for Soviet relief efforts, and publicly challenged American reluctance to commit ground forces to Western Europe. Woody Guthrie wrote a song about her called Miss Pavlichenko that celebrated her kills and criticized American inaction. The Soviet leadership initially hesitated to fully embrace what Lyudmila represented because doing so required admitting that their pre-war military doctrine had been catastrophically wrong about women's capabilities. For decades, Soviet military theory had assumed that women could serve valuable support roles but lacked the physical strength, emotional stability, and killer instinct required for frontline combat. Lyudmila and the hundreds of successful female snipers, pilots, tank drivers, and infantry soldiers destroyed this assumption so thoroughly that maintaining it became impossible. By 1943, the Soviet military had quietly revised its policies to allow women into virtually all combat roles, though these changes were never announced as a reversal of previous doctrine. Instead, they were framed as wartime expedients, temporary measures that would presumably be reversed after victory. Senior commanders who had initially opposed female combat troops now publicly praised their contributions while privately insisting this didn't invalidate general principles about gender and warfare. This cognitive dissonance allowed the military establishment to accept Lyudmila's effectiveness without formally acknowledging that their previous assumptions had been prejudiced nonsense. After the war, Lyudmila struggled with what modern medicine would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, though Soviet psychology had no framework for diagnosing or treating combat trauma. She completed a master's degree in history and worked as a historian for the Soviet Navy, positions that kept her in military circles but far from combat. She drank heavily, slept poorly, and avoided discussing her wartime service except when officially required to appear at state functions. She married twice more, both relationships ending in divorce, and maintained minimal contact with her son, unable to reconcile her identity as a mother with her identity as a killer. The Soviet government paraded her at Victory Day celebrations and used her image in propaganda, but provided no mental health support or acknowledgement that killing 309 people might have lasting psychological consequences, regardless of how justified those killings were. She died in 1974 at age 58 from complications of a stroke, her later years marked by chronic health problems, likely exacerbated by wartime stress and injuries. At her funeral, she was honored as a hero of the Soviet Union and buried with full military honors in Moscow's Novodevichy Cemetery. Her legacy extended far beyond her individual kill count, though that number remains staggering by any measure. She proved definitively that women could perform at elite levels in combat roles that military establishments worldwide had reserved exclusively for men. Female snipers became a standard component of Soviet military doctrine, and other nations eventually followed, though often decades later. American military forces didn't officially allow women in ground combat roles until 2013, 71 years after Lyudmila demonstrated the concept's viability. Modern military sniper training programs now study her tactics and fieldcraft alongside those of legendary male snipers like Simo Haiha and Carlos Hathcock, recognizing that effective killing requires skills that have nothing to do with gender. Her story also highlighted an uncomfortable truth that military organizations still struggle to accept. The most effective soldiers are not necessarily those who fit traditional masculine stereotypes of aggression and physical dominance. Patience, observational skill, emotional control, and tactical intelligence often matter more than raw strength or conventional courage. Lyudmila possessed all these qualities in abundance, combined with a cold determination forged by watching her country invaded and her people slaughtered. She channeled her rage into methodical, precise violence that killed more enemy soldiers than entire infantry companies managed during the same period. She did this not by being exceptionally strong or naturally aggressive, but by being smarter, calmer, and more disciplined than the men she hunted. In the end, the 19-year-old history student became history herself, a reminder that war reveals capabilities that peacetime societies prefer to ignore, and that survival sometimes requires ordinary people to become extraordinary killers.